This is really a pivotal time for the world economy. And sometimes when you sit in Australia, you think, well, life is good. You look outside, blue skies. We've survived the global financial crisis, or at least that's what we're told by the government. And we think that maybe the global financial crisis is over. But if you look at what's happening in Europe in particular, what you realize is that the global financial crisis is far from over, and that what we've done is we have created the circumstances in which we have transferred it from being a private crisis within the banking sector into a state finance crisis. And if one wanted to actually see evidence of that, then the evidence is there in terms of what's happening in Ireland. And Ireland is facing D-Day at the European Union Summit, which takes place later today in Brussels. One country looks like it's not going to be there, and that's Portugal. The Prime Minister of Portugal resigned last night over opposition to the austerity measures that have to be introduced in Portugal to prevent the need for Portugal to go to the international community for an emergency bailout along the lines of the one that Ireland has had to go to. So today what I really want to look at is what are the issues, what are the fundamental issues that need to be addressed and are ultimately being addressed at the moment in the discussions in Brussels, but also in the discussions in the United States, and ultimately issues that will reverberate from Washington, from Brussels, through to the financial markets here in Asia Pacific. And in many ways, you can see that there are 5 key policy conundrums that need to be kind of resolved. The first one, most important thing, is why did the internal risk management systems fail within major institutions? Alan Greenspan very famously gave evidence in 2008 in Washington, and he stated that he was in a state of disbelief that major banking corporations could behave so irresponsibly. So why did these internal risk managements fail? And why did they fail given the fact that we had a major crisis at the turn of the millennium as a consequence of the collapse of Enron, WorldCom, Adelphi Crossing, etc., which created the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which had as its centerpiece Section 404 on internal controls, that there needed to be a significant beefing up of internal controls. Now, Sarbanes-Oxley reverberated around the world in a way in which you had, well, we don't want to have a rules-based approach to these issues, let's adopt a principles-based approach to these issues, and this was the view very much propagated by the Financial Services Authority in the United Kingdom. And of course, what we've seen in the global financial crisis is that the Financial Services Authority model of risk-based regulation, of principles-based regulation, also was suboptimal. So then this leads to the second question of whether or not the crisis was a result of inadequate rules, gaps between the rules, people transacting their way around the rules, or was it a question of inadequate supervision? And if it was a question of inadequate supervision, why was that the case? What was really interesting, I think, earlier this year was that the International Monetary Fund did a self-evaluation through its evaluation office as to its performance in the lead up to the global financial crisis. And the critical conclusion was that the main failure derived from the inculcation of groupthink. Groupthink within the agency, groupthink within regulatory agencies around the world, groupthink in terms of the notion that innovation was the most appropriate way to move forward. It's not just the IMF which has recognized that there is a danger of groupthink. The chief economist of the Bank of International Settlements gave a very interesting speech in Mumbai in 2009, in which he also suggested that groupthink was at play. And why? Because it was in nobody's interest to stop it. And that brings you back to the infamous interview that Chuck Prince, the former chief executive of Citigroup, gave to the Financial Times in 2007, in which he said there might be a liquidity pressure event in the future, but at the moment we don't see it. And because we don't see it, the music is playing, and because the music's still playing, we're still dancing. This was the groupthink that basically was at play. And the crucial question then becomes one of why did the groupthink extend to the regulatory agencies? Why couldn't the regulatory agencies take a contrarian point of view? And was the problem, therefore, in terms of inadequate supervision, linked to a failure in the conceptual underpinnings of the regulatory system? This then raises a really interesting question of what is the role of the state in the governance of financial markets. Is its role simply to enforce or accept the sanctity of contracts so that corporate law could be viewed and should be viewed primarily as an enabling proposition? And if not, if the state should intervene at an earlier stage, what are the implications? And on what basis could it be justified? What we saw in the aftermath of Enron, for example, was a massive ramping up of regulatory capacity through the innovative use of creative enforcement mechanisms to deal with the problem of creative compliance. Of course, in the immediate aftermath of Enron and WorldCom and the passage of Sarbanes-Oxley, there was business quiescence to that framework. But that progressively dissipated from 2004 onwards. And you had major debates in the United States that the problem was not a problem of finance being out of control, but the ultimate problem was that regulators were out of control. And so the pendulum, the regulatory pendulum, shifts all of the time. At the moment, there is clearly an enormous amount of authority to regulatory agencies. But what are they doing with that authority? And so then ultimately this then leads you to the question of how do you resolve this tension between private and public law? And of course, the issues are magnified by the question of answering the question of what is the purpose of regulation. Not necessarily how do you regulate, but why do you regulate? The real problem that regulators face around the world is that in the aftermath of a crisis, we design a fantastic system to deal with the past crisis. So it's always reactive rather than necessarily proactive. It's reactive rather than preemptive. And so if we wanted to have a preemptive dimension, how do we ensure that that is not going to stifle innovation? One of the things that's really interesting about the global financial crisis is that much of what occurred was technically legal. Yes, there was criminality on the margins, but a lot of what happened was actually legal. It was a misjudgment, a catastrophic misjudgment, but a misjudgment nonetheless. So that then raises the question of how do we embed higher standards of integrity? If the crisis is best seen as an ethical crisis, how do we actually instill an ethical framework into regulatory systems? And if so, if we can, what measures are likely to be effective and how does one judge success? Because what is required is some independent assessment of the subterranean pressures that are building up within and between regulatory jurisdictions. So that's the ultimate conundrum. Now, as I've mentioned, part of the problem is this erosion of restraint. That you had this creative compliance, you had this technically legal reality, and this feeds back into work that has been done by social scientists for some time, Dorian McBarnett, for example, from the University of Oxford. But what the crisis really demonstrates is what the cumulative effect of transactional imperatives and compartmentalized conceptions of what responsibility is on the integrity of the system as a whole. Now, some work has been done in this by the institutional economists, most notably by Oliver Williamson, who talked really about the need to examine how systems operate in practice. And what he believed was that underpinning all governance arrangements is a non-calculative social contract, which Williamson argued accretes over a period of time, 100 to a 500-year time frame, and once accreted, remains static. Everybody knows what is expected within the non-calculative social contract. That turns out not to be the case. And because that is not the case, that requires us to rethink, to reframe, in many ways, the nature of the problem. And of course, it's not just people like Oliver Williamson who are suggesting this. George Soros set up a new institute for new economic thinking, which he argues what we're witnessing is not simply an economic crisis, but also a crisis in economics. And that what is required is basically some way of reframing our regulatory frameworks and our business practices to take into account the reality that the efficient market hypothesis has fundamental problems. And I think the work of Cassidy, John Cassidy from the New Yorker, is very, very useful in this regard, in which he traces the history of how economic thought impacts on economic practice and on regulatory capacity. And it's a very interesting take on basically how the law and economics tradition basically took hold through basically the work of the efficient market hypothesis. And what you see in that process, which I think is really interesting, is the notion that what is economically rational is actually politically constructed. So you have to pay attention to the ideational terms of reference. The ideational terms of reference creates the parameters of what is deemed to be acceptable or unacceptable practice, or acceptable or unacceptable policy innovation. And in many ways, this brings us back to the classic argument between Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn very famously has been cast as a revolutionary, not least because the title of his seminal book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, basically argues that sometimes you have seismic shifts, and the seismic shifts mean that you have to reconfigure how you operate. Now, a lot of social scientists basically thought this was great and we can actually have new paradigms coming up all of the time. But in actual fact, what Kuhn really was arguing is that most of the time, people work within normal science and normal terms of terms of reference. The impact of that is that that actually ends up, in many ways, enlightening why groupthink takes hold. Now, Popper, on the other hand, argued that theory could only remain valid as long as it wasn't falsified. And that our job as social scientists is to basically develop theory, work within the terms of that framework theory until such time as the empirical evidence falsify the theory, at which stage you have to accept that basically the theory is no longer valid. And it needs to be either adjusted or it needs to be replaced. What the global financial crisis has demonstrated in many ways is that in actual fact we cannot have a band-aid solution using the efficient market hypothesis, that is unsustainable in the longer terms. And that requires us to really think about these debates and to pay attention not only to what the rules are, but how the rules are created, why they're created in the way that they are, and to really examine the dynamics of financial regulation. And in many ways, once we do that, we can then see the critical importance of these ideational terms of reference, linked to, as I mentioned, Alan Greenspan and also Claudio Barrio from the Bank of International Settlements. Now, why this is really difficult was really highlighted by Rajan in his new book, Fault Lines, in which he argued that he had looked at the empirical evidence about the overheating of the US housing economy in 2005, 2006, gave a presentation at Jackson's Hole in Wyoming, and basically in his book he outlines what happened behind the scenes when he gave this address. And he said that giving that address was like being a Christian going into a Roman amphitheater, being fed to the lions. Nobody wanted to know. How could you basically raise questions about this? By raising questions, you are being very difficult, and you are also actually potentially causing instability. So if we have to rethink the power of ideational terms of reference, we really need to figure out what mechanisms, what tools we can use to do that. We can't necessarily simply rely on past adherence to the law and economics tradition linked into efficient markets, nor can we rely on innovations in sociology. The most important innovation in economic sociology recently has been actor network theory. And what that has actually demonstrated is a sense of deep ethnographic analysis of what's going on within groups. But what you find with it is, in actual fact, it lacks a normative dimension. It just examines what happens. So it's no coincidence that the most recent conference organized by the scholars who run actor network theory was creating alpha in actor network theory. They had totally internalized the terms of reference of those that they were studying. And that's quite problematic. So what we've seen is basically a failure of models, failure of conceptual frameworks. This was most notably the case in Iceland, where you had the catastrophic failure, followed by some earnest deliberation and soul-searching. It's quite interesting that Iceland created a truth commission to find out what was going on. So it wasn't just simply a failure of the banks, it wasn't just simply a failure of the regulator, it wasn't simply a failure of the political establishment, but it was also something that was deeply embedded in society. And that if we wanted to cauterize that and move forward, we really needed to understand that. And so that's why the Truth Commission was quite interesting in Reykjavik. We've seen basically the failures in Washington because of the slavish adherence to a rules-based approach. And now we've got the passage of the Wall Street Reform and Investor Protection Act. And the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, is mandated to do no less than 10 studies, write 100 new rules, without necessarily going back to Congress. And what will happen is basically that will create a new set of rules. And this happens at the same time as London's Financial Services Authority has disintegrated, its model has disintegrated. And so now we're in a situation where you don't have the countervailing force of principles-based regulation to counter the rules-based approach. And this brings us to Ireland, where Ireland failed catastrophically in relation to the global financial crisis. But here's the interesting thing. What happened in Ireland happened alongside the global financial crisis. This was a homegrown crisis. This was a classic failure of supervision. Ireland, in terms of rules on the books, had a fantastic regulatory system. It privileged light touch regulation, principles-based regulation. The enabling framework presented itself as a key European actor, developed the International Services Centre, developed the mechanism for banks to come in and use Ireland as an international financial services centre. And all of this taking place at the same time as the Celtic Tiger economy, with this boom in house prices. And so now what we've seen with the collapse of the Irish economy is really kind of like what happens when you have neither a commitment to rules nor a commitment to principles. Hector Sanz of the Financial Services Authority gave a very interesting speech in 2009. He said it's very difficult to have a system of principles-based regulation over people with no principles. And only yesterday, we had a situation in which a long-running tribunal of inquiry into payments to politicians, into the corruption associated with the awarding of a major telecommunications mobile phone license, basically came down. It cost €250 million to do this inquiry. And its findings came down yesterday. And they found that basically the relevant minister had interfered in the licensing process, and the recommendation is that the further action should be taken. Now, the politician in question topped the poll in the recent Irish election. So kind of go figure, right? What is going on when you have someone who has been under investigation for such a long period of time? Basically, people have known for a long time that there are question marks about this guy. He lost the whip. He worked for the previous, or for the current governing party, Fine Gael. He was a minister for Fine Gael, which is now back in power. He then stood as an independent, and he topped the poll. So we've got a real problem in Ireland. So why is Ireland important? Well, Patrick Honohan, who is the governor of the Central Bank of Ireland, a very famous economist, worked for the World Bank for a long period of time, and he gave a very interesting speech in Geneva a couple of weeks ago. And I'll come on to the detail of the speech a bit later, but the point that he's making here is that Ireland is likely to be the country case most studied by future generations of students of this crisis. Why? Because it's a meta-crisis. It's not just an economic crisis. It's not just a political crisis. It's not just a regulatory crisis. It's a social crisis. As the extent of the austerity measures required to bring Ireland back to a state in which it can grow, as those austerity measures begin to take effect, we are going to see major social problems in Ireland. Portugal is a bit further down the track because it's already had 6 austerity measures introduced. The final one inflicted yesterday demonstrates that death by 1,000 cuts only requires 6. That's the problem. So if you want to look at Ireland as the laboratory, how do you do it? Those paying attention can see that Ireland is spelled on the end here. So is it basically a land of irresponsible governance, regulatory capture, exuberance gone mad, liar loans, liar economy, atrocious mismanagement, nonchalant disregard for the long-term effects of what happens, and ultimately a society in which basically there's a denial of responsibility? Is that the vision of what Ireland is? It certainly wasn't the vision of the Celtic Tiger. It's not that long ago when the Celtic Tiger model was talked about as this is the way in which a small peripheral country can grow without any resources other than its people. So is that the vision of what Ireland is? Well, certainly that's where Ireland is at the moment. An alternative vision, however, is also possible. I have to make sure that I did get Ireland spelled out. But so it did have an innovative economy throughout the 1990s. It has the capacity to have a responsive regulatory regime, now, precisely because all of the major banks and financial institutions are under state control. It can be an engine room for European reform, because if Ireland fails, so too potentially does the euro. It can be a laboratory for accountable governance, and I'll come on to how that is happening in a moment. It can demonstrate that you can have austerity with compassion. And as a consequence, it can engage in nation building through an effective process of democratic governance. So that opportunity is there for Ireland at the moment. The critical question is, will it take it? Will it take advantage of that? Or will we go back to the politics of our former Minister for Communications, the gum-bean politics, the politics of the parish pump, as they call it in Ireland? 10, whether or not that can be done, we really need to map the regulatory system. And of course, the regulatory system is a complex mechanism that includes physical and social geography, so to speak, rules, practices, the animating ideas that are associated with the regulation of a particular risk or hazard. In this case, what size should we have, should the banking sector be? How should we regulate it? Why should we regulate it in the way that we're regulating it? So for us to do that, we really have to look not just at the formal rules, but also the informal rules governing practice, how they're established, how they're legitimated, how they're interpreted. To what extent have Irish bankers, for example, recognized that responsibility for failure lies with the failure of internal risk management? The policy conundrum questions that I posed at the beginning of this talk. And that means for us to do that, we really need to look at how these policy settings operate and the configuration, or indeed the reconfiguration, of the state in terms of what its responsibility is in governing financial markets domestically and through its participation in international bodies, basically how it wants to affect change. Now, one can be forgiven for being quite cynical about all of this. I remember writing about problems in the Irish Financial Services Centre, the International Financial Services Centre, in 2005, 2006, and that's one of the reasons why I came to Australia, in fact. And coming back, publishing this in the Irish Times, I was brought in for re-education by the financial regulator. You know, this is really damaging to how we want to grow financial services, and our role as a regulator is to actually help grow financial services, and that I needed re-educated. So that was fine, moved to Australia. Then everything started falling apart with the Irish banks, and there was a report commissioned by the government, by conducted by PricewaterhouseCoopers, in which basically it highlighted problems within one of the major banks, that it was overly exposed to the property sector, over-reliance on a small number of players, and that there was insufficient or inadequate risk management. So a lot of the material was redacted, but some of the material did come out. But the problem was, it was clear that the PricewaterhouseCoopers report also did a similar investigation of the other banks. And that information was not disclosed. So all of the debates that took place in 2009, 2010, all took place in a vacuum, because we didn't know how bad the situation was within the other banks. Now, interestingly, Enda Kenny, the new Prime Minister, the new Taoiseach of Ireland, is going to the European Summit today, and his argument is, well, we're doing new stress tests, And the new stress tests are going to be available on the 31st of March. And they're going to be much more robust than the ones that happened in the past, much more transparent in terms of how we've come to our conclusion, and we're going to effect serious change. But I can't tell you what the results of those stress tests are going to be, because they're not going to be made public until after the EU summit, right? So again, one can be, excused for being slightly cynical about this. So this was the problem basically in 2009. So in 2010, November 2010, just after Ireland went to the European Union and the International Monetary Fund for an emergency bailout, I was sitting in New York, and I was ashamed to be Irish. And so I wrote, after being quite quiet on this in the Irish Times for a while, I wrote a rant about how terrible a situation this was. And as a very good friend of mine said to me, well, Justin, it was a coherent rant, but it was a rant nonetheless. And you can, the reason why I did it, however, was I was so angered that basically the debate had all taken place behind closed doors. There was no accountability. The government kept telling us, oh, this is a problem that can be controlled. This is a problem which is containable. And of course, this is what we've been told internationally about the GFC. Right? From 2007 onwards, this is only a problem in the US housing market. It's got nothing to do with anybody else. And of course, we've seen the consequences of all of that. Now, so what is Ireland actually thinking about doing to deal with the reality of its indebtedness? Well, one of the things that the governor of the Central Bank of Ireland has pointed out is, well, we've got to accept that there was credulity in the past, that mechanical risk management models really don't work, right? There's a recognition that the problems facing Ireland are huge and getting worse. But there's also the call to the European community and beyond that in actual fact it's nobody's interest for us to fail, right? And so if financial engineering failed in the past, maybe we could have a new form of financial engineering to create new mechanisms to restore market confidence. That's what the governor is deciding to do. Now, the issue for Ireland, in many ways, has been summed up by Kevin Myers, a very influential commentator in Ireland in terms of, well, we got this problem of politics, of cabalism, and that ultimately this is what happens when you have such a society. Or the very influential lexicon in the Financial Times, which really humiliated Ireland by using its own literary traditions to basically go back to them and say that effectively the Irish banks were involved in a process of dissembling. And it's now abundantly clear that that's exactly what happened. So the question is, how do you move forward? Well, this is where basically we have a major problem. The scale of the problem facing Ireland is huge. The bailout comprises 67.5 billion euro from the international community, with an internal commitment to provide an additional 17.5 billion, made up of raiding the pension fund and basically austerity cuts. The reason why this is really difficult for Ireland is that already gross debt is at 95% of GDP. And that's expected to rise to 113% in 2014, with the potential of reaching 120% of GDP in 2015. These figures have not been seen in Ireland since the early 1980s. So all of the advances of the Celtic Tiger economy have disappeared. Ireland is now back to the situation it was in the early 1980s. Irish banks are really dangerously reliant on the European Central Bank. European Central Bank exposure stands at roughly 140 billion. That moves basically month to month. And the problem is, for Ireland to get this money from the international community, it's had to basically take that money at an interest rate of 5.8%, well above the actual funding cost. So the question then becomes, is this protecting against moral hazard, or is this punitive in terms of what is going to happen? So the European community has suggested to Ireland, well, you need to have massive restructuring of your banks. You need to engage in a complete turnaround of your financial services sector. And by the way, you also need to agree to change your corporation tax, which at 12.5% is one of the lowest nominal rates in the European Union. If there was tax harmonization, recent research conducted by the Oxford Institute of Tax suggests that whilst there won't be very much difference across the European Union as a whole, the net effect on Ireland would be to shave 3% of GDP. So when you're in a situation where you're already trading at 95%, your debt's 95% of GDP, then basically shaving 3% off is a huge ask for the Irish government. Now, the interesting thing is everybody calls this the EU IMF bailout, but in actual fact, there were three different components within the negotiation process. There was obviously the European Central Bank, then there was the European Union, and then there was the IMF. In actual fact, from speaking to people involved in those negotiations, the IMF was actually the least conditional of the groups. And as somebody said to me, it wasn't us negotiating with the international community, it was us negotiating with the European Union, the European Central Bank, the IMF, all of which had very differing agendas. But what you can actually see here in terms of where Ireland is facing at the moment is that its sovereignty has all but disappeared. In order to access this cash, there has to be a whole series of reviews, quarterly reviews, with release of more money dependent on progress. So there has to be a fiscal consolidation, and there has to be major financial sector reform. Recapitalization of the banks. Now here's the interesting thing. This agreement was signed in November. The first tranche of the recapitalization was due at the end of January in the midst of a general election campaign. And the Minister for Finance said, well, actually, we're not going to actually recapitalize the banks because we haven't got the mandate of the people to do so. This was a great political stroke because it actually forces the new government to actually do this. Second, that there would be a deleveraging within the banks themselves. And thirdly, there would be a reorganization. Now, the interesting thing about the reorganization is that what the Irish financial regulator has suggested this week is that there now should be the introduction of what they call a fit and proper test in terms of who should be on the boards of Irish banks. And that what is required is an assessment not only of technical expertise, but also an assessment of personal financial soundness, and also an assessment of their knowledge of principles of corporate governance and risk management. Now, it's unclear at this stage how that test is going to be administered. But what it also suggests to you is that Ireland has recognized that we cannot simply leave it to the market or to the individual banks to actually fix the problems. So this is very much an interventionist approach. What's also really interesting about that is the governor of the central bank's speech in Geneva earlier this month, in which he stated that he believed, notwithstanding the moves towards ethics and integrity and a fit and proper test, he believed it was impossible for Irish banks to effect the kind of cultural change that is required. And that the whole purpose of the reorganization is to effectively put the banks up for sale. He effectively used his speech in Geneva to start an auction. And to ensure that people were not buying a pig in a poke, as they say in Ireland, what he would do would be he would organize a complete reorganization. And that complete reorganization would mean, if you had a foreign ownership, a bank from Germany or from France, for example, then the regulation of that bank would actually be conducted by the French and by the Germans under the EU passport system. So effectively, Ireland is going into this summit with very little sovereignty left. The danger for the European Union is by forcing Ireland's hand on the tax harmonisation agenda, it could provoke Ireland to exercise its veto. Exercising its veto in the context of the Portuguese government already falling could lead to a destabilisation of the European project itself. So the summit and the decisions that are being taken at the summit today and tomorrow will tell us an awful lot about the trajectory of reform within the European Union. But the decisions that are being taken place at a bureaucratic level by the central bank and by the Irish financial regulator also suggest a growing recognition that the efficient market hypothesis has failed and a growing recognition that new regulatory tools are required. So I'll leave it there. So thank you very much.